as we take a look and head into the book of Galatians. And just a little bit about our structure. Each of the weeks will be the same in that we'll always start out with an upfront teaching. And then about 15 minutes in, we'll be split out into breakup groups. In the afternoon, we've got two, and we've got our facilitators there to lead that conversation. And we'll close at the end of the hour at 2 o'clock. So I'm going to share my screen here. Is that text coming through large enough to see it there?
Yes.
Let's do some nods. Lovely. Michael, could I ask you to read this for us? This is I'm going to chose to dive into the text first, and then I'm going to go back and speak to it afterwards. This is from the second chapter in the book of Galatians.
Sure.
Thanks, Michael.
But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistent with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And we have come to believe in Christ Jesus, so that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by doing the works of the law, because no one will be justified by the works of the law. But if, in our effort to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have been found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not. But if I build up the very things that I once tore down, then I just demonstrate that I am a transgressor. For through the law, I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if justification comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing.
Thank you, Michael. And if you're feeling confused on that and that you didn't get every last point, you're not foolish. It's just hard. And that's sometimes what it means to dive into the books. And you might understand the language, but sometimes people are using terms in different ways. So I'm going to kick us off and share a few thoughts here to try to orient us to what's happening by way of background and heading into these 4 weeks. So we've got Paul the Apostle, and he is not somebody who was a disciple of Jesus during Jesus's earthly ministry, but Paul would say he had a physical, visceral, spiritual encounter with Jesus. And there's a famous story where he's literally riding on his horse and he gets knocked off his high horse, and Jesus has him go blind. And then this guy who was a persecutor of the church, his name was Saul, he converts to actually being a great evangelist of the church, and his name changes to Paul. So this Paul that we're talking about here, he journeyed all through the Mediterranean during the evangelism part of his ministry. And at one point, he was staying in the area of Asia Minor, kind of Turkey, that sort of area. And he came down with some sort of physical ailment, and we don't know exactly what, but some historians think it had something to do with his eyes, some sort of ailment there. And the Galatians in the town, they received him warmly, so it was very positive. Paul, as he was wont to do, he preached the gospel while he was there in this town, and it was received with much enthusiasm. So all good so far. Sometime after his first or his second visit to them, other itinerant missionaries arrived to preach Christ. And that was not uncommon. People were traveling around sharing all kinds of messages in the first century. And however, what they were urging is that this predominantly Gentile crowd, which for our purposes here today, all that means is non-Jew. So when we hear Gentiles and Jews, it just means non-Jews and Jews. So these other missionaries are coming in, urging that this predominantly non-Jewish crowd accept this Jewish practice of circumcision to really secure their place among the people of God. Now, this may seem foreign to us. It may not, but for them, it was not a straightforward decision because the practice of circumcision was according to Jewish law. And just about all these earliest people who were following Jesus were themselves Jews. And Jesus said he didn't come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it. So these early Jewish Christians were wrestling with, okay, am I Jewish or am I Christian? What does that all mean? And it was a period of flux. And so these missionaries come to the Galatians, who are living in a pagan environment, multicultural place, and just vulnerable to what does it mean to live out my faith, not unlike you and I. And they're there and they hear these missionaries coming along saying, if you really, really want to be sure that you're in with God and in with the holy people, then you should get circumcised. And only if you do this will you be saved. And so Paul hears about this from wherever he is, and he writes this letter to the Galatians. And it was written about 20 years after Jesus had died, so 53 to 55. A little bit about the letter more broadly. So if you've read any of the epistles, epistle just means letter in the New Testament, they often start with a kind of formula. Hey, I'm Paul, you're so-and-so, it's great to see you, God bless you. Galatians does not start like that. So Galatians is the only Pauline letter in which the traditional prayer of thanksgiving for them is omitted. That is, he sort of gets in, shuts the door, and just kind of gets down to business. If you've heard stories from the Gospels or been in church, you may know a huge chunk of the Gospels, these stories about Jesus, a huge chunk is taken up with telling stories about how Jesus shared meals with people he wasn't supposed to eat with, tax collectors, sinners, women, the demon-possessed, etc. So here are these Jewish followers of Jesus, who himself is Jewish. They're entering into this brand new territory, this grand experiment of what does it mean to live after he's died and is risen again. And if fellowship with Jesus really and truly is open to everyone, then what does that look like at the dinner table? Because a faithful Jew was taught you don't have fellowship at that table with someone who's not a Jew. Now, sometimes we in 2023 fall prey to the idea that the way forward was crystal clear to the early church because Jesus was right there, or he had just left the room like 5 minutes ago, so they knew what to do. But it's not true. They were working out things for the first time too, just like we are. And the account of their working it all out, we call the New Testament. And the New Testament encapsulates those arguments too. So Paul hears about this guy Cephas. He goes by another name that you might have heard of, Peter. So this is the same Peter from the Gospels, the same Peter that bailed on Jesus, who later Jesus said, no, you're going to become the rock that's going to build the church. And Paul hears that Peter and others are influenced by these other missionaries coming along, and that they themselves, although they'd started eating with non-Jews, all of a sudden stop. And Paul says, no, we can't do this. And the thinking went like this. If you're a non-Jewish follower of Jesus and you want to eat with the Jewish Christians, you have to get circumcised. And Paul said no. And he picked up his pen and he started writing. And he expresses astonishment that they could be persuaded, and makes a case for kind of the title of this course, for finding grace. And Paul thinks that to submit to circumcision, to do this ritual act, is to turn back on a new freedom that they've been given in Christ. And the thinking kind of goes like this. If there's a test to be applied to what our preaching is or how we're communicating our faith, do we say that Jesus is the liberator, the source of freedom, the source of salvation without any qualifications? Or where are we tempted to say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, and I also want to make sure I do more good things than bad things, or whatever that is. And Paul gets right at the point, and he says, we cannot have anything added to Jesus in this equation here, or it's just going to take away from this all being a gift of God. The basic question that was before Paul and is before this question in the book of Galatians is, how does God save people? It's a harder answer than you think, because you can say faith, but what do we mean by that? And if our answer is you've got to have enough faith, and if you have enough faith, then God will save you, this too can become a deadly trap, because how do I know if I have enough faith? Is it simply that I have more than the person that's next to me? What if I have a lot of faith, but in the wrong thing? Or, as some of us that have traveled in Christian circles for a while, what if my faith almost becomes like a work in itself? Like, God, see, like I was super faithful and was like a great Christian today. Now you kind of owe me the blessings. And so we can sometimes treat faith almost like a quid pro quo. I'll do the faith thing, God, if you give me this other thing. Without going too deep into it now, and we'll look at it a little bit more in our groups. Verse 16 from the passage where it talks, let me see, pull it up here. Paul says, we know that a person is justified, that is made right with God, not by the works that they do, but through faith in Jesus Christ. People, that kind of makes sense on a level, but another way of translating that is, we know that people are justified not by faith in Christ, but by the faith of Christ. That is, it's not so much our faith and whether we have like 5% or 95%, but it's about Christ's faith, like his faithfulness, his obedience. And we go kind of, all in on the poker chips, not because we're convinced our faith is so strong and we're believing in the right person, but because the faithfulness of Christ is so strong. And in light of Christ's faithfulness and obedience and love, our relative faithlessness doesn't hold up. And this faithfulness of Christ, despite our messing up, our getting it wrong, our making mistakes, our not knowing who to eat with and who not, this understanding that it's the faith of Christ, that nothing can overcome that. It is so strong. And that's where this unique Christian notion of grace comes, that there's nothing we can do to make God love us more, and there's nothing we can do to make God love us less. That in Jesus, all that love has been expressed and is there, for us. We're going to look in our breakout groups in a few minutes at one section from that passage, verses 19 to 21, which I consider a kind of climax of the argument that Paul is making here. So he's talking about being united with Christ, and if something, Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again, that what Paul is getting at here is that there's a union with Christ that happens. It's not simply that I believe in Jesus or say a certain thing, but that in some profound way, Christ becomes a part of me, or I become a part of Christ. And then it's not simply up to me as Andrew Federle, but, it's a communal, collective thing. And I think about us as Anglicans and our liturgical tradition and traveling through Holy Week. And that, in a really profound way, is what we're leaning into when we journey from Good Friday to Holy Saturday to Easter Sunday, that what happens to Jesus happens to us, not simply as a metaphor or an example or a, let's sacrifice for the good, but that in a profound way, Jesus dies and we die too. Jesus is risen and we rise too. And what Paul's getting at, and I'll end with this, is that the locus or the focus for our unity as people who are learning to follow Jesus is not because we're all the same. It's not because we're all Jewish or we're all non-Jewish. It's not even because we all think the same way, or definitely not that we look the same. Our unity is that it's in Christ that we're united together. What unifies me and Michael Butchery is not that we go to the same church, but that Christ died for both of us and loves us. And it's that profound unity in the person of Christ that Paul is seeking to hold on to and flag from this, what seems like a very kind of straightforward thing about, who do you eat with at the dinner table? So lots more that could be said as we wade into Galatians. Like I said, we're wading into different terms and terminology. It's one of the shortest books in the New Testament, but has had a absolutely outmoded effect on people, most notably Martin Luther, who was actually an Augustinian monk and was kind of hit between the eyes with this notion of grace, that actually there's nothing we can do to make God love us because God already does. And that's what we're going to be leaning into in these coming weeks.